What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by Trufan. And before we get into today's conversation with Eric Dahan, there's a couple things that we need to go over first. Number one, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider leaving a rating and a review. The more positive ratings and reviews we get, the more it helps new people find the show and really helps to grow the community that we're developing here. And if you're one of those people that have recently found the podcast, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for future episodes. I put out brand new interviews every single Monday, and brand new takeaways is an audio exclusive every single Thursday where I sit down and break down the most recent podcast episode of the week. And last but not least, if you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it to your Instagram story. Tag myself at the Jacob Kelly. Tag Open Influence at Open Influence. And I'll feature you on my account and send you a message as well. And now, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Eric Dahan. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by Trufan, and today we are joined by Eric Dahan. And Eric is one of the pioneers of the influencer marketing industry. He's the CEO and co-founder of Open Influence, a global influencer marketing agency helping brands create alongside extraordinary human beings using an approach built on years of innovation. I'm excited to have Eric here on the podcast today to discuss growing a global agency and how you can leverage influencer marketing for your business. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And where I want to start, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. And when I was preparing for this podcast, I heard it referenced a lot that your background and your family is deeply entrenched in the fashion industry, but no one ever really got into how that was on any of the podcasts or the interviews I was listening to. So I'm curious, is your dad Jerome Dahan?
No, my dad is Albert Dahan. And so oddly enough, I'm part of a group of French Moroccans that live in LA and somehow found their way into the fashion industry. And as a little bit of reference, Dahan is almost like the Smith of Moroccans. And so there are a lot of Dahans out there. I don't think I'm related to Jerome, but somehow they're travel in similar circles. But my dad's Albert Dahan, and my uncle's Joe Dahan, and they created a brand called Joe's Jeans years back.
Okay, interesting. Because Jerome Dahan's also in jeans as well, as far as I'm aware.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And so then being around fashion, like how did that influence you growing up then?
Yeah. So it's funny. I never was that excited about fashion, quite honestly. The thing that always got me energized was the business side of things. When I would go to the warehouse or the factory with my dad, when I'd just be hanging out after class, waiting for him to finish work, and just sitting in on a meeting and seeing how him and his team would approach problem solving, and how the sort of dynamics work, between them, their customers were the large retailers and boutique shops, between their suppliers, and it was just really fascinating being a fly on the wall, watching all of that. And I guess that's what really got me excited. But the part of the business I didn't really like and wasn't really for me was the actual design and look and feel. I just felt that it was something that was a little too intangible for me to wrap my head around, and it was nice, but the business side was a lot more exciting than the sort of design and artistic side of the industry.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard you say too that the fashion industry understood influencer marketing early on. And I'm curious as to why and how that was.
Yeah. So one of the things the fashion industry has done for as long as I could remember was gift products to celebrities. And so every brand had a book that they either kept in their lobby or the CEO kept on his desk. And there were several of these around. And that book was essentially a bunch of magazine clippings of celebrities wearing their product, right? So whether it be like Halle Berry wearing a pair of jeans or whomever, right, from People Magazine or Us Weekly or whatever that, or Vogue, whatever it was. And it was their press book. And essentially when influencer marketing started to really take off and when influence moved online, and on platforms like Instagram and Twitter, the fashion industry really understood that because all of a sudden, this really analog way of getting celebrities to share their content, right? By celebrities wearing it, someone in the paparazzi taking a photo, a large magazine buying that photo or publishing it, people reading it. Now all of a sudden, you had a much a path with much less friction for the celebrity to share that same image. And so for them, this was like a no-brainer. It was almost like they went from moving goods on dirt roads to having a railroad to do it with a lot less friction, a lot easier. So I think that was one of the main drivers for the fashion industry to really look at this and say, okay, this is just like what we've always been doing, have been doing, but just much easier.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but your first kind of foray, or where the light bulb first went off for you in terms of influencer marketing, was through fashion. But it was pre-Splurge, if I'm not mistaken. It's when your brother partnered with a couple influencers back in 2011 that he met at a club to market some jeans and saw some pretty good results. Is that kind of the first time that influencer marketing, like that light bulb, went off for you?
100%. And to be quite honest, it didn't fully go off for me then. So but my brother Alex fully understood this and saw this. So he, when we were still in the early days of starting Splurge, which was a flash sales aggregator, which still had a foot in fashion, but was much more tech heavy. Alex started a denim brand, and he only had maybe like 5 or 6 samples that he made. So wasn't in production. Really nothing yet, other than some well designed jeans. And he, within his network, started finding people that had followings on Instagram and Twitter, 20,000, 30,000 followers, and working with them and having them just take a picture wearing these samples. And funny enough, because there were samples, he'd ask for them back after they'd post about it, but have them wearing these samples. And I mean, instantly, we'd go through and see the comments where people would say, where can I buy this? Where can I get it? There was no website at the time. There was nothing. And there was this just immense amount of demand being generated. And so, looking at that, the light bulb went off, but it was still at a time, I think, when social had a question mark of whether social could really become social commerce or drive commerce, and especially for a platform like Instagram, which was just seen as a platform for kids, right, more or less. So we saw all this demand, and then the next thing was figuring out, can we then convert this demand into actual purchases? But it was very incredible, and that's where that's where we decided to start testing that with this app Splurge, and that's when we were able to see on the back end that these purchases were real, and the demand was highly valuable.
Mm-hmm. And so talk to me about Splurge for a minute. So you said it was an aggregator of different flash sales. So was this inspired from your time when you worked as an intern at Haute Look?
Yeah, definitely. Haute Look was a great internship because I was in my comfort zone, so to speak, because it was still in the fashion industry. So I felt like I knew enough, but it had nothing to do really with the fashion itself and more with the market dynamics and the marketing and the technology piece. And so being there, it was really interesting getting to look under the hood of that whole industry. And at the time, what I realized was there were hundreds of flash sale sites coming out and new ones every day. There was a flash sale site for everything, from wine and spirits to baby products. There were flash sale sites for men, for women, for gadgets, just anything you could imagine. And very early on, I said, well, I'm getting bombarded left and right with these daily deals from all these different sites. Most of them aren't really relevant to me. How great would it be to create an experience where I only was shown relevant deals and the system would just learn over time what was relevant to me, and what I cared about, right? So what kind of price points did I want to shop within? What brands did I like? What kind of clothing did I like? Who influenced my purchase decision? And so we created a really simple feed that would just show you different deals randomly based on what it thought you liked. And yeah, that was kind of the idea behind it, and that's how we got started.
Hmm. And then so where open influencer at the time, Instagram would have started, and when you were taking Splurge, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but you were taking Splurge to different trade shows and events and trying to get businesses on the platform, but they were more interested in how you were marketing your app as opposed to the platform itself, right?
Correct. Yeah. And so a little bit of interesting story there. So we started Splurge when I was, you know, senior year of college, just graduating. And one of the big challenges we had two challenges actually. One was raising money. We were very bright eyed, thinking it'd be so easy to raise millions of dollars. Everyone else was doing it. It seemed when you'd open up Wired or TechCrunch or VentureBeat or what have you. And so we found out very quickly that it's actually kind of hard to raise money. And we saw a bit of a catch 22 where we needed money to build an audience, but it was really hard to raise money without an audience because we wouldn't have had proof of concept without an audience. So that's where we turned to influencers, and this was really before the word was coined the way it is now. To just start marketing, right? It was a very much so grassroots guerrilla marketing tactic that Alex uncovered. And so we were working with influencers, having them post. And that's when we saw that they were driving real users to the app. We saw thousands of downloads per day coming in every time an influencer would post. And mind you, these were smaller influencers with 20, 30,000 followers. And then we'd see real purchases. But the challenge we had was because we're aggregating deals, the purchases, even a purchase for $100 might have only turned into like $3 or $4 for us. So the margins were razor thin. And so even though we were generating, a lot of great organic traction, we realized very quickly that we wouldn't be able to scale, a flash sales business with like a 3 to 5% margin. It just would not have been sustainable for us to do so. And that's when we decided to say, okay, let's start going to trade shows and talking to brands directly about featuring their products on the app. And after several conversations, we found that a lot of brands, were not interested in moving discounted goods to flash sale sites. They were being smarter with how they manufactured and managed their inventory. They had flash sale sites coming to them willing to just buy the goods outright instead of doing so on consignment. And so we just saw a lot of friction there. And that's when we, were kind of like scratching our heads after a few pitches, and we realized, well, yeah, we went and we pitched this, but everyone always asked us how we were marketing the app, and everyone was really intrigued when we were telling them how we were marketing the app because we're explaining to them that we had a user base, right? And so after a few of those pitches, I just went up to the next company at the trade show in Vegas and I said, hey, we have marketing capabilities. We built this app. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I want to show you what the conversions look like on the back end. We could do this for your brand too. And that's really what got people excited. And that's at that moment is when we made a pivot and said, okay, let's maybe shelve this flash sales idea. We're getting a lot more interest on the marketing side, and the problem that we had and we solved for is a problem that a lot of others have. So let's see if we could share that solution with others in the market.
I was going to ask if it was difficult to make that transition, but it sounds like so you literally made the call to pivot the business on the fly, then like right there at that trade show.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it. I mean, it was a very quick pivot, right? But I think it wasn't a flippant. It wasn't flip in terms of saying like, hey, whatever, let's just try whatever. But it was almost like I think subconsciously we felt the friction. We saw this working really well. And when we were at the trade show and having those conversations, it validated it. And with that business, it just felt like we were pushing a really heavy rock up a hill, and and we're getting diminishing returns for our efforts, right? And so but we found that with the marketing side, I mean, people were just so much more interested. So there was a very stark contrast between the two. So it made that decision really apparent and very clear, and quite honestly, just felt right. And yeah, it was a hard decision, but it was a quick one. And um, ultimately, I think it's fair to say it was the right decision as well.
Okay. And talk to me then about the early days of open influence. You said that influencer wasn't even a coined term at the time. Like, what were words people using for influencer back then? Like, how was like the first 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, it was very interesting. So I think it comes back to social as a whole had a big question mark on it, right? People were wondering, can social turn into real commerce? It's when you had sites like The Fancy come out, and that was sort of the big experiment of can someone bridge this gap between social media and actual purchases? There was a big question mark on the whole space, um, and you had the mobile revolution happening at the time, and so I think the big one of the big crazy things is you had at the time you did have um, what we refer to now as influencers, but there were YouTubers, there were bloggers, and they were very much so seen as like digital celebrities, right? They were still being looked at through that lens. Uh, it was seen as like a talent celebrity business where you had a few really big names. You're buying into their cachet, their brand equity. The businesses that were set up around them were talent agencies. Um, and we were kind of crazy because we said, okay, well, everyone has a smartphone. These new apps that are coming out are lowering the barrier to entry to content creation. So really anyone can just create content and post it. And, creating a nice image on Instagram is a lot easier than creating a really nice high quality video on YouTube, especially at the time. Um, and so, we had this belief that the business would ultimately be a demand side business, not a supply side, which meant we'd represent the advertisers as opposed to the talent. And in those early days, the businesses that we're working with, quote unquote influencers, were like your MCNs that were representing the YouTubers, and a lot of that work was really rev share with Google and working on like a lot of pre-roll ads and whatnot, not too much sort of native ads that we're used to today with influencers, and also doing a lot of work with bloggers and the blogger agencies, which were exclusively representing the talent. But like in terms of kind of to paint a little bit of a picture, we'd call the quote unquote influencers social celebrities. We'd call them social media promoters, Instagrammers. Insta famous was a big term. Vlogger, blogger specifically, again referring to the bloggers. So there wasn't really a word to encapsulate this new trend. Again, they're really seen as celebrities, and some funny stories too. I mean, I remember working with some of the biggest names now, not to mention names, but we'd be the idea of someone paying them to do a post was unheard of. And it'd be like, hey, here's $100 to post on socials. Like, oh my god, you mean someone's gonna pay me to share something on my social media account? So it was a really crazy time, and we're running the business out of a duplex, and we had influencers come by every week to pick up their checks. One of the rooms was turned into a storage room, and there was a dining room table full of a ton of soft drinks, tons of Diet Coke and Coke Zeros, and monitors, and that's kind of how we got it started.
That's amazing. And is it true that early on you were working with one influencer who was still, I believe, still in high school, and he ended up getting grounded or something like the day of an event, and his mom took his phone, and you guys were having trouble tracking down this influencer?
Yeah, that's completely true. It's a very, it's a. I remember because we locked in a deal with one of the the biggest studios, movie studios out there, and we're really excited about this deal. And the studio loved this influencer, and the night before, his mom shot us a note saying, "Oh, my son's not going to do anything." And we called, and she's like, "I took away his phone," and we're like, we're paying your son thousands of dollars to do this post. It needs to happen. And you could hear, uh, the influencer's dad in the background yelling to, trying to make a case to give him the phone. And so it was crazy. We ended up losing that one and having to find a different influencer to replace him. But nonetheless, it was. I think it was a good story to show you know how crazy the talent business can be, regardless of what side you sit on.
Absolutely. And so this was, I guess, probably 2013, 2014. And then 2015, you guys raised your Series A. You're talking about all these people are raising money and you had trouble with Splurge, but you were able to do it with open influence. Like, what are some things you learned during that process of raising money in 2015?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the, I think one of the big things that I've learned is when you think about investors, you have one notion in your head, but ultimately there's a big level of social validation involved, right? Like, and almost like a little bit of like a pack mentality of, investors want to do a deal that others are in on, right? They look for like what other investors are doing to validate that, which I was surprised with. It's a big thing, like credibility and having other investors validate and seeing what others are doing really influences, that community as a whole. But one of the stories that from my experience is when we first went out, there was this notion of wanting to invest in a unicorn. Everyone wanted that unicorn. They wanted the business that would become the multi-billion-dollar business. And if you presented them with VCs with a good business, but not that multi-billion-dollar idea, not the next Facebook or Amazon, it was a lukewarm response. And so, when we came out, we're like, we think this trend is going to be very massive. Uh, we think there's a huge market and it's going to be very disruptive. But ultimately, you know, at this stage, like this is really a services business. Um, the advertisers don't know what to do when it comes to influencers. We're dealing with people, so we need people to deal with them. And it's almost like what I learned early on is there was this sort of discount to saying a service business. Like we had very aggressive projections and goals, and everyone believed in it. But even so, it just wasn't in vogue for what with what the VC community was looking for. They didn't want a real business with solid fundamentals. They wanted something that was a unicorn and hyper growth. Um, and so that was kind of an interesting take early on. But going through that process, I think was pretty interesting and eye opening. You have a lot of conversations. I think what really drives people to the table too is just knowing that you're talking to others and others are looking to invest. Um, and it was a learning process for me personally and for the team, but really happy with what we did. And we always had a very conservative mentality with growth, especially after Splurge, where with Splurge we went out thinking, oh yeah, we can you know flip a switch and generate hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. And we took a much more realistic lens with how to manage money and how to manage the growth of a business. And so, we're pretty conservative in the amount we raised, because we're confident that we're going to be really capital efficient as a company.
Mhm. And fast forward to today, you have over 500,000 influencers within your network, correct?
Yep.
And so I'm curious then so the influencer marketing is projected to be, I've seen projections in the next couple of years, right? And anywhere from 6.5 to $10 billion. But I'm curious, with someone with a network of over 500,000 influencers, how do you classify whether somebody has influence or not?
Yeah. So it comes down to one thing, which is trust, right? And if I break that down a little further, it's it's trust in a particular category that's relevant to you, right? And what do I mean by that? If you're if you're looking for legal advice, you're going to look to someone, one that's a lawyer, right? That's credible in that field and that you trust and whose advice you trust in that particular topic. Now, you might not look to them for fashion advice, right? You might not look to them for dating advice, but they're very relevant and very influential to you in terms of legal advice. And that's really what's key. I think for a very long time, there's been this notion that popularity is trust. And the number one rule that we found out is like popularity is not influence and popularity is not trust. Popularity is a vanity metric. If you have 50 million followers, but you can't sway them to do anything, you don't have any influence. You have visibility, but not influence, right? And so I think in today's world, visibility is cheap, right? You could run ads all day and put billboards up and digital banner ads up all day, but people have blindness to that. It's that trust that's going to cause a message or allow a message to resonate with someone. And that's what influencers have. So when we're working with clients, we're really telling them, look, it's not about finding the biggest name. Like really focus on finding the right person, the most relevant person. And the way we'll do that is we have a set of tools. We analyze every post an influencer does. We pick apart the text, the contents of the image or the video, and that allows us to say, okay, this influencer talks about these sort of things, and here's how their audience reacts and engages with that kind of content. If the audience engages a lot when this influencer talks about, clean eating, we know that, they're pretty relevant in that matter. When they maybe talk about travel, their audience engages less. We know their audience cares less about that kind of information. And so that's a really good proxy that we use. And we've built an entire system and taxonomy around this to really classify influence. And I'd love to say this was some theoretical brainchild that we came up with, but really this just kind of came about from us trying to solve real problems that we faced as we were scaling the business.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that then you break down influencer basically on like a granular post by post basis, and you evaluate them on the type of content, not just overall, and like average likes, average comments, and things like that. So like you can look. So for example, say they have like 1,000 likes on average, but you notice that gym content, they get 1,500 likes, but for nutrition content, they only get 500. So you're breaking things down on like a post by post basis. So you know exactly what type of collaborations to do with each individual influencer.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and then we take it a step further too, and we could say like, if it's around like looking at nutrition, we'll look at their sponsored engagement versus non-sponsored, which lets us know too, helps us dive deeper and analyze if the sponsored engagement rate is much lower. What are they doing wrong when they're doing that sponsorship, or is there something inherently with their audience or their relationship with the audience where sponsored messaging just isn't working too well? But yeah, we get really, really granular, and it's a big part of our approach and our quote unquote secret sauce. In how we build out campaigns and help our clients maximize value in the influencer space.
And so then what does this look like on a brand side? So when a brand comes in and is working with you, do you essentially provide them with like a list of influencers that you've vetted, you've sourced based off of different criteria? Is there like a dashboard that they log into? Like what does that look like for a brand?
Yeah. So they have a full dashboard, and typically, they have a dashboard at every step of the process where they can oversee when influencers are posting. They can approve content. They can approve the influencers themselves. They can see the reporting. We can go back and forth in terms of notes on each influencer in there. But typically, the way we would do it is we dive in really deep, and we will queue up a set of influencers based on the brand's needs using our search engine, and we queue those influencers up for the brand to review in the dashboard. And one of the main reasons we do the work for the brand and not just have them put together a list is, I think there's still a lot of bias with brands and how they approach influencer marketing, and this space is evolving so fast with so many nuances. It's one thing to have a really powerful search engine, and it's another thing to know how to use it and what to look for. And so that's where we have our team, that know what really are the metrics to focus on and when. Uh, and that's part of the rationale when we select the influencers we recommend for a campaign. We're providing that rationale to the clients as well, so they can understand. Okay, here's why we're choosing this person. Here's how it ties back to the goal of the campaign. Here's the KPI we're going to focus on, and here's how it fits in. And really, we're really taking the you know the black box approach, or I want to say like the magic sort of out of it, and really looking at influencers through a very scientific and pragmatic and systematic lens to really make it clear how at each step we're working to drive value, and showing that it's not, hey, you just send a bunch of stuff to influencers and you have success, but it's really understanding how to drive that at each and every step to ensure that you will have a successful campaign.
Mhm. As you're kind of detailing that, I'm sure a lot of people are picturing working with like influencer marketing, working with like a bigger brand, whether just for like a big fashion brand or like clothing company or whatever it may be. But so I'm curious, is influencer marketing still applicable and effective for small businesses?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think the pitfall that a lot of smaller businesses have with influencer marketing is there's a certain level of time investment that's needed, whether it be on their side or through an agency they're working with. And I think there's almost like this very binary view where it's either you're paying people tens of thousands of dollars or you're getting them to do stuff for free. And the truth is, they're neither of those are really the right path, especially for a small business. For example, if you think you're just going to gift out a bunch of stuff to influencers and have them post, well, influencers are getting free stuff all the time, and if you're going to send out a bunch of product and the product has a cost to it, you just be prepared for only a small fraction of the influencers to post, and there's a cost right there that you can measure, which is an effective payment, right? If you sent out 100 products and the products are costing you $10 each, right? That's $1,000. And if two influencers post, well, you're effectively paying $500 to post, and you lose the control to guide them. So I think with startups, it's definitely leaning in more micro. It's definitely taking smaller bets with influencers, but I think making sure that you do pay them so you can ensure that the content gets posted and it gets posted properly so that it is effective. But I think when I hear things like, oh, influencer marketing doesn't work for small brands or whatnot, it's typically because they're taking a blind and shotgun approach to it, and they're not being effective. They're just again doing a shotgun approach and hoping it works out well, which you can't in this industry. You have to be really precise, and really thorough and run a thorough process to have a successful campaign.
Absolutely. And like I've interviewed micro influencers, a specific micro influencer on this podcast. And when he was running contests for brands, he was averaging like a 20%, not just engagement rate, but like comment rate. So 20% of the people that follow him were commenting on his contest. And I'm curious, in other conversations I've had on this podcast is people talking about bigger brands instead of partnering with the bigger influencers, taking that budget that they would use to work with one big influencer and breaking that up and working with a lot of micro influencers. Is that a trend or something you're starting to see more and more of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, but I think with the bigger brands, there's still the big brands want a level of control of the process, and so oddly enough, the big brands become the bottleneck, so to speak, in terms of the number of influencers they can engage with, rather than the influencers themselves, right? So, they want to approve every single piece of content, go through multiple rounds of review, and so what we tend to see is the economics tend to kind of float with the bigger brands, where they're working with more mid tail influencers and maybe lower mid tail, and less micro at scale. Um, but the micro influencers are incredibly effective. I mean, they have more trust amongst their audience, relatively speaking, because their audience is just tighter and they haven't expanded it beyond that. they're seen as more like everyday people like us as opposed to celebrities in their own right. And so, it's extremely effective, and it's something I definitely recommend. I think as brands kind of cross that learning curve, we're going to see the big brands, um, working with more and more micro influencers and being okay, sort of changing the process that they're now used to in order to do that.
And another term I've heard starting to hear get thrown around is nano influencers. And I think someone said people with like 2,000 followers or less or something like that. At what point is it just people that we're working with and not necessarily influencers? Like, is nano influencers a trend that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think a lot of it's definitely been a buzzword that we hear a lot. Personally, I feel like nano influencers are just people, uh, especially from a brand lens, because the economics with how you would engage a nano influencer is actually pretty similar to just how you would engage a loyal customer, right? Yes, you want them to share. Yes, you want them to post, um, and you want to encourage them, to create any sort of user generated content for the brand. But you're not engaging with them in the same sense where you're paying them to post or you're necessarily gifting them free product because, if you're Nike and you want to send a $200 pair of shoes to someone with 1,500 followers, the economics don't really make sense. You might instead, um, you know give them a 10% discount or 15% discount, or some sort of reward instead. Um, but you wouldn't necessarily, or some sort of referral, uh, you know program, have them be part of some sort of like peer-to-peer referral program. But yeah, I think just kind of where the market is, and how the economics stack up. Nano influencers, for all intents and purposes, are just people, and I think the way you engage with a nano influencer is how you should plan on just engaging with a regular customer that doesn't really have a large social following.
And a little bit earlier, you mentioned how the bigger brands like to kind of have a little bit more control. They like to go through multiple rounds of revisions, see every single piece of content. Another thing I've heard just having conversations both on and off this podcast is a thing that brands get wrong is not giving enough creative freedom to the influencers. Is that something you're seeing? And what are some other things that brands get wrong when it comes to influencer marketing?
Yeah, yeah, I think creative freedom is definitely a big one. I think, you know at least for the most part for our client base, it's less and less the case. We're not seeing it as much now, but I think a lot of brands go from this approach of saying, "Hey, let's just send out a bunch of free stuff and see who posts," and kind of like no creative control and just handing over the reins to then going to the other extreme of being too prescriptive. What's key is really understanding how do you create a creative brief for the influencers to where you can keep a really consistent brand DNA, to where people can look at from one influencer to the next and see a real consistency in theme, and they could recognize that, and they could recognize that that content is part of your brand, and that same campaign, but enough room for the influencer's own voice to shine through. Because ultimately, there's a reason, influencers don't just repost other people's content for the most part. There's a reason that's not effective, right? And it hasn't taken off. It's because influencers really understand their audience, and they need to customize the message for their audience. So I think that's one of the big mistakes. I think the other one comes down to just looking at the metrics, and a lot of brands are just looking at vanity metrics and focusing on that too much. I also think there's just kind of a lack of understanding of how to approach influencer marketing. Some look at it as like a pure, look at it from like a programmatic lens of, hey, here's how we're gonna, work with them, and they undervalue the importance of creative, because creative is really that X factor, um, that allows you to perform above average, right? It's what people are consuming, right? They're consuming the content itself. So if the content isn't good, well, guess what? People aren't going to engage with it. So I think a lot of companies are too focused on impressions and CPMs, as opposed to, yes, you need to focus on that, but focus just as much on what the content's going to look like and how does that, convey your message properly, and how does that fit into a bigger strategy?
And you mentioned how like some brands will look at it as programmatic, but at the end of the day, it's not just programmatic when you're working with people, right? Um, but but on that thought, I'm curious about, speaking of working with people, have you done any work with virtual influencers so far? And is that something you're going to think we're going to start to see more of?
Yeah, yeah. So we have we've done I think several campaigns with virtual influencers. I think it's really interesting, right? We've gone from this really fragmented information landscape where people were empowered with the same tools that big broadcasters and publishers had a monopoly over, right? And now with this idea of virtual influencers, I mean, it's kind of going back and saying like, how do you create a personality that's not real? In our definition, but from a content perspective, is perfectly real, right? I mean, influencers to most fans, they only exist in the form of the content they share, right? So there's not really a big difference, if that's really the the user's experience or the consumer's experience with them. What difference does it make if they're a real person or a virtual one? And I think as we see more advances in AI technology, which we're seeing for nefarious purposes now being used in the form of deep fakes, but as we see that evolve, I mean, I definitely see a world where um, a lot of content being created will be machine made. And I think with that, there's a big possibility for virtual influencers to rise, but keeping in mind that the dynamics of trust and relevance are just as important, regardless if those influencers are real. So I think that's one possible hurdle that the virtual influencer world might have is, and the big question is, can they establish trust with audiences just as well? Um, you know, and I think in many cases yes, but I do think there might be a bit more challenge.
With one kind of on that note, then, and with considering AI, in theory, like, could you scale a video, like almost like a video calling type platform with an AI influencer where like you, me, and 100 other people could call the same influencer at the same time and have one-to-one conversation with them because they're not actually a real person. So using AI, you could somehow give them a personality that can interact with you one-to-one on a video call. Like, is that something you could see happening down the line?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely down the line, right? If you look at um, artificial intelligence, and neural nets, right, and how they learn, it's really an associative piece of machinery, similar to how our brains work, and it's very different than what we think of as a traditional computer, right, where you input very specific and precise commands, and you'll get the same result every time, right? With an AI, it could really learn things similar to how a human can. And to give an example, the way artificial intelligence learns how to identify what a cat looks like is same as a child. You'll show it hundreds of thousands of pictures of a cat, of different types of cats, and it'll build this model of a cat, right? And so when you show it a picture, if it looks like a cat, it will call it a cat. So it's very similar to how we as humans learn and see the world. Now, what you're talking about, is a little bit more of like a general artificial intelligence, which I think now what we're seeing is artificial intelligence is does a really good job with very specific applications. Looking, for tumors in an MRI, being able to identify what's in an image, being able to pull out different sort of patterns. But I think I think it's definitely coming, and we're not as far as we think from it, right? And I think in terms of having a conversation with an AI, I mean, I think it's a matter of the Turing test, right? And but with advances to you know to to these virtual influencers and avatars, and in terms of what we're seeing was just AI learning how to interact with people and the amount of data and social data available for those machines to learn. I don't think it's right around the corner, but I think it's a lot closer than we expect.
I saw somewhere that virtual influencers have 2 to 3x engagement of other influencers, like, comparatively. Is that because with an influencer, there's, like, no emotion and essentially you can mold that person to whoever their audience is and exactly what they're looking for? Or do you have any insight as to why virtual influencers would get more engagement to a comparative regular person influencer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think to speculate, I think what you touched on is 100%. What I would say is the reason, right? Because you could engineer that person to optimize for engagement, right? It's an algorithm, and every time someone engages, it gets a little bit of feedback and could modify itself and modify the content it gets. Right now with virtual influencers, that's being done less programmatically and being done more through intelligent design from the designers that are running it. But it's the same mechanism, right? Um, they don't have the same sort of impediments that a human influencer might for optimizing towards engagement, right? We're all human. We have that. Part of that is really what makes us, uh, you know, engaging and interesting. But by being able to tweak that, you could really optimize to drive more of a certain behavior, and in this case, engagement.
Mhm. And I feel like when a lot of people talk influencer marketing, they often think of Instagram, maybe YouTube, but I'm curious how influencer marketing changes platform to platform and if there's any platforms that tend to perform better on average than others.
Yeah, I think when people think about influencers, they have this notion of this sort of vain model type person, quasi fashion, beauty, what have you. Very very lifestyle focused. And I think that's sort of the understanding, right? It's like almost like the celebrity lifestyle kind of in a digital world. But that's really the wrong approach. I mean, and that's one of my personal pet peeves is that notion because really influencers are anyone, right? We've worked with influencers that are mechanics and teachers and online educators and scuba divers and all sorts of experts and just real people just sharing, real bits of information and just, sometimes living a very regular life or having certain subject matter expertise. And so, wherever there's content creation and people, I think there's influence. And that's one thing. In terms of like platforms, we work with influencers across the board from, Instagram and YouTube, which I think are really, as of now at least, the 800-pound gorillas when it comes to influencer marketing in the U.S. But we've worked with influencers on Weibo, TikTok, Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook, really sort of everything across the board. Twitch, you name it. And so, in terms of which platforms are best, I think it just really depends on what the strategy is and what the brand's looking to achieve. TikTok right now is a really exciting platform and one I definitely recommend for brands to at least try. If you're looking, for example, to market a product that has a bit more of a steeper education curve, I think YouTube's a great platform for that because you could really delve into a topic and explain it and spend time and followers on or subscribers on YouTube are extremely loyal to the influencers that they're following. Instagram is a great place, obviously, for visual and discovery. It's great for social validation. You could have a lot of people talking about the same sort of thing, which reinforces a message and creates additional buzz. And I guess it just really depends on what's right and who the audience is you're looking to target, what's the message, and then for those types of influencers, where do they tend to live? If you're looking to go into the business realm, for example, like LinkedIn is a great platform, and over the past year or so has really taken off in a big way in terms of developing a base of influencers that aren't necessarily Fortune 500 CEOs and billionaires.
I'm actually curious. I know we're running out of time here, so I just want to ask you about TikTok because I know you guys have been on TikTok since it was Musically, and I used to do a lot of promotional with soundtracks for different movie studios. So you've seen the progression of the platform. So why is it exciting for influencer marketing right now?
Yeah, when we were so back in the Musically days is exactly that. We were working with the platform for just promoting those original soundtracks and scores. And it was very focused, and like the record labels kind of dabbled in it a little bit, but not really. Uh, why right now? I think the platform has just really taken off. Post merger, right? And you have a lot of talent that has organically sprung up and just found new use cases for the platform. And so it's been less about creators also creating on TikTok, but that extra adoption means there's been this whole community that has evolved with the platform. And then the other interesting trend is the platform has just been aging up pretty rapidly, as well as very diverse, right? Instead of Musically, where it was kind of just like original scores and lip syncing and songs, there's some other stuff. I mean, now you go on the platform, there's financial advice, there are comedians on there. Um, there's all sorts of storytelling happening well beyond just dance videos. And so I think that's contributed in a big way to the platform. And I remember kind of early on, there's always been this interest in solving the idea of kind of this short form storytelling with music. I remember like Flipagram tried going after this space. Phone companies like HTC had like their own quasi social app for stitching together images with sound. Apple was playing with their version of like the memories where they again piece together your different images and put together a slideshow and put music over it. So I think for a while everyone's kind of known that there's something there, but I think TikTok has really, from at least a product standpoint, an adoption standpoint, really found struck a vein with that.
Mhm. And I know we're running out of time here. You got your meeting. I don't want to make you late. So I'm going to jump to my last question. I know there's a lot more things we could talk about. Not only are you an expert and a pioneer in the influencer marketing space, but you've also grown an international multi-million dollar business. And so there's so much more I could talk to you about. Maybe we'll have to get you back on the podcast one day. But I'm going to jump to the last question, which is the final question I ask every single person. And I like to flip the script a little bit with the last question. So instead of me asking the question, it's you asking the question, but it's not to me. So pretend you have a crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question. You'll get the 100% honest answer. What is one question you'd like to know the answer to?
Wow. Oh man, this is a tough one. You know, I don't know if I'd want to know the answer to be honest. I kind of like there's an excitement to kind of not knowing what's what to expect or what's going to happen. Um, you know, I think the big question would probably be like do I you know looking at like an older me in the future, like, what regrets will I have? That's probably it, right? I mean, would I make decisions, especially like life personal decisions? I use the benchmark if I just picture myself, you know, in my 60s and thinking like, even though that's not that old anymore, but I picture myself in my 60s and I think, what regrets will I have if I make this decision or don't make this decision, and that helps inform whether I do it or not. I don't try to think like, will this work out? Will this not? I just think, if this doesn't work out or it's a bad decision, will I still be happy that I took the risk? So I guess the question I'd ask myself, or that I'd ask and want to know the answer to is what regrets I'll have in the future, if any.
Mhm. That's a good question. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to be on this podcast. I want to give you the floor. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
Oh man. Okay. You can first go to openinfluence.com. There you'll have links to all our social accounts. We're in our blog. You could find me personally on LinkedIn. Just type in Eric Dahan. That's probably the platform I'm most active on. And feel free to shoot me a note. And you could email me directly as well. Just eric@openinfluence.com. So many ways to get in touch, but I'd say take the time to follow us as a company on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and follow me personally on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. I want to thank you once again for taking time to be in this podcast. And I want to thank everybody for listening, whether you've listened the entire way through or you only listen to bits and pieces. I really appreciate you taking time to check this out. Do me a big favor, everyone. Go and follow Open Influence. Go and check out their website. Go and follow Eric. Connect with him on LinkedIn. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. My DMs are always open. If you'd like to follow the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at My Social Life Podcast or YouTube by searching up My Social Life. As always, today's podcast is powered by Trufan. Thank you once again for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon.